Pleasure to welcome you to this special program this evening on U.S.-Mexican migration, a Catholic view. We're very honored to have four very distinguished speakers. We're going to have to move a bit swiftly with our program this evening because the ambassador of Mexico has to leave at 6:50, I believe. Maybe we'll keep you here a little bit more. Anyhow, we'll do our best with giving you the time that you need. Ambassador Surukhan is the ambassador of Mexico to the United States. As someone who was in the diplomatic service himself, I can take one look at him and tell that they picked a winner. They had to. The relationship between Mexico and the United States is one of the very, very important, one of the most important ones we have. So we have to have an ambassador here who can represent Mexico at the very, very highest level. And obviously you have done that. And I will not elaborate any further in terms of his background. You have a copy of his bio on the back of the program. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Ambassador Surukhan.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. This is really special. It's the first time that I've been sort of actually speaking from, even if it's a mock courtroom, a courtroom. So I hope we don't pass judgment on anyone or anything tonight. Ambassador, thank you for those very kind words. You're very generous. And I apologize before my formal remarks, but I have to catch a flight out of Reagan Airport at 8 o'clock, so I will have to sort of run as quickly as I can to make it on time and go through TSA screening. Let me, obviously, I think this is a very, very relevant issue that we are here to discuss today. And let me start by obviously recognizing the very important role that the Catholic Church has played in this country as to providing greater understanding and knowledge of the context, of the importance of what's at stake in this critically important debate, but also the role of the Catholic Church in other countries like my own, but also countries south of Mexico, as we deal with some of the challenges of countries that are no longer just senders of migrants to the United States, but like Mexico, have become either A, countries of destiny, or countries of transmigration, especially of Latin American migrants who traverse Mexico at great peril to reach the United States. So I want to underscore the role that the Church, the Catholic Church in the United States has played in this debate, the leadership that it has provided, and the moral voice in the bully pulpit by using the bully pulpit in addressing a very divisive, very polarizing issue in American politics and in the American political debate these days. I'll state the obvious. I'll state the self-evident truth, but not because it's self-evident is it least relevant or less important, which is that there is no more important issue that will define the future of the relationship between Mexico and the United States than getting immigration reform right. Certainly there are many other issues, and in a relationship as complex as the U.S. and Mexico relationship that is so broad and deep. There are many issues today, whether it's the fight against organized crime, whether it's border infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's how do we continue to facilitate trade and continue to create economic growth. There are so many issues on the agenda, but none in the long term will define the success or failure of this bilateral relationship that we have been building now for a generation than getting immigration reform right. And before I define what getting immigration reform right means, let me also underscore why it's important, because I think that despite when people speak about special relationships that the United States has with other countries on the face of the earth for historical, diplomatic, and even military reasons, one tends to link special relationship and Great Britain in the same sentence. But let me, without annoying or angering my British colleagues with whom I have a very good relationship, suggest that the true, unique, special relationship the United States has on the face of the earth is with one other country, Mexico. Not only because the fates of these two countries are entwined and the security, the well-being, and the prosperity of both nations depend on each other's success, and on my firm belief that a rising tide can, should, and will lift boats on both sides of our common border. But because there is one unique characteristic of this relationship, which is that we have truly seen the birth of the first intermestic relationship on the face of the earth. What do I mean by intermestic? That there is no longer a separation between foreign policy and domestic policy. If the foreign policy agenda between Mexico and the United States is to advance and become constructive, as it is, we will need to challenge and take on domestic constituencies and domestic politics on both sides of our border. If you look at any single issue of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, every single one of those issues is grounded in the domestic politics and in domestic constituencies of both countries. If you need to move on trade, you're going to have to take on domestic constituencies in the United States. If you take on border infrastructure, you're going to have to take on domestic constituencies and players in the United States, and so forth. We need to be able to move the foreign policy agenda between our two countries forward, understand that the lines between domestic politics and policy and foreign policy have disappeared. Thus, intermestic, the combination of international and domestic. That is the reality of our agenda. And this is why this issue, immigration reform, and immigration, and getting immigration right, and understanding the root causes of labor mobility in the Western Hemisphere is critically important, because it cuts across both foreign policy and domestic policy issues. And as most things in life, you need two to tango. You need things that need to be done on the Mexican side of the border, and you need to see things done and happen on the U.S. side of the border. For starters, in Mexico, we need to be able to generate and trigger economic growth that will anchor 350,000 bold, entrepreneurial, talented women and men that try and cross the border every year into the United States because they're searching for a better paid job. And I'll say this very bluntly, and I know that this group in particular understands it because you see it in your parishes, you see it in your communities, you see it in your churches. The loss of Mexico is the gain of the United States. If we can't hold on to these talented, entrepreneurial, bold women and men, Mexico will not be able to grow at the rate of growth that Mexico needs to grow to bridge the economic asymmetries between Mexico and the United States. And it is these economic asymmetries that drive a lot of the labor flows that we see from Mexico into the United States. So we need to continue to grow at a faster rate of growth to anchor these jobs and these women and men in Mexico. We need to do it long term. But we also, as a government, as a state, need to ensure that every Mexican that crosses the border into the United States does so legally, with a passport, through a port of entry. Because if we don't solve that challenge, this will continue to feed upon the very poisonous and toxic debate about legality linked to immigration that is festering in American society. At the same time, we need on this side of the border an immigration reform that makes sense. One that A, brings 11.2 million people out of the shadows, not only because we need to guarantee their rights, but because even if the issue is about security, it certainly makes much more sense to know who these individuals are, where they come from, what their names are, than not to know who they are. So A, we have to do something with 11.2 million undocumented people, and deporting all of them is a no-go. It's ridiculous. We need to bring them out of the shadows. But at the same time, we need to bring back labor mobility across our border. And I know this is also a very toxic debate and issue, as those who believe in comprehensive immigration reform try and figure ways in which a temporary worker program can fit into the larger scheme of getting immigration reform right. But this is critically important for one very powerful reason, because despite what some pundits on cable TV would like to suggest, it's not that more and more Mexicans, and I'll talk about Mexicans because that is the country that I represent, but I think this is certainly the case for most nationalities, at least most Latin American countries that are seeing migrants cross Mexico on their way to the United States. But in the case of Mexicans, it is not that more and more Mexicans have crossed over the border without papers in the last decade. If you look at the numbers, we have seen a plateau of around 300, 350,000 per year for the past decade, with a small blip that we saw in the year 2000, which I have pressed my friends who are in the business of statistics or demography or the economy to give me an explanation, and I don't understand why, with the exception of the year 2000, where we saw a peak, the level has remained at the same 300, 350,000 number for the past 10 years. But what has changed in the past decade is that more and more women and men that have crossed without papers into the United States are staying put. They're not going back, and they're not going back and forth as they used to. Why? Because the combination of immigration policies that were triggered by the Clinton administration, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Guardian, and then reinforced by post 9/11 security, what they did was break down the pattern of circularity that existed across our border for decades. And what do I mean by this? If I was a agricultural worker from Oaxaca, from the Mixteca Poblana, I would, before 9/11, I would probably cross the border on my first attempt, and I probably would not have to pay anything to a coyote or smuggler to get me across the border. I would then go to Washington State and work in the harvest, in the apple harvest season, then probably move on to Long Island to do some roofing, and then over the holidays, over Christmas, I would probably go back to Mexico, and then the next year I would do exactly the same thing. People would go back and forth. After 9/11, this came abruptly to an end, because if, again, I'm the worker, I am no longer able to cross on my first attempt. I'm crossing on my 7th, 8th, or 9th attempt. And number two, I'm no longer getting across with something to a mom and pop coyote. I'm paying anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 to organized crime that has muscled its way into the business of human trafficking. So once I'm on this side of the border, the incentives that used to exist that would allow me to go back and forth as I did in the past have completely disappeared. So what has changed in the past decade is that more and more individuals who are crossing the border without papers, once they're on this side of the border, they're staying put. And this is the challenge that we need to address when we talk about bringing back circularity to the labor movement through a temporary worker program that will legally, in an orderly fashion, guaranteeing the full observance of their labor and human rights, allow willing employees to meet willing employers. We have a very successful program, We Mexico, with Canada, that we've had now for 30 plus years, in which 40,000 agricultural workers every year go back and forth from Canada to Mexico. They have employers who have trained them over the years. They go back and forth. Their families are in Mexico. They travel safely. They travel with a visa. They have a job. They are well paid. Their labor rights not violated. And every year they go back and forth. Now, albeit 40,000 workers is this big if you compare it to approximately 6 million undocumented Mexican migrants that we have in the United States today. But I think it's a very powerful example of a system that can provide the ability to ensure labor mobility, and a labor mobility which at the end of the day should provide for the economic well-being of communities on both sides of the border. At the end of the day, the challenge that we have is one of public narratives. Because if you talk to most Americans, they feel that undocumented immigration in the United States is an issue related to the rule of law. Have these individuals broken the law to come in without papers into the United States? Whereas in Mexico, the narrative is a combined narrative of A, are these individuals being given the fair treatment that they deserve because of their contributions to the economic, social, cultural well-being of the United States, and B, these individuals have the right to migrate. And until we confront this very differing perception that exists in public opinion regarding what is behind immigration and immigration flows, it's going to be very hard to reconcile those two very different versions and perceptions. But we have to continue to work on this, and we have to continue to ensure that we are doing our job in Mexico to generate economic growth, jobs, that we are ensuring that migrants' rights are not being violated as they cross Mexican territory. This is one of the reasons why in 2008 Mexico decriminalized immigration through Mexico. This is one of the reasons why I have been very vocal since the day I arrived in Washington in underscoring that Mexico cannot preach to the north what it does not do to the south, and that we have to be able to ensure that the rights of migrants coming through Mexico are not violated. And these are some of the challenges that we face as we seek to provide a much more holistic understanding of labor mobility and immigration. But at the end of the day, this will only work if our American partners, if U.S. society, is willing to engage in a very toxic and very divisive debate over how do you get immigration reform done. And this, again, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, is probably the most important challenge that we, my generation of diplomats, my generation of pundits and thinkers, my generation of businessmen, my generation of community organizers will face. If we don't get this one right, this issue will continue to fester and will continue to contaminate the wellspring of values, of aspirations that join our two peoples and our two societies together. And this is why, fully cognizant that this debate is very toxic and is very divisive in America today, have to tread carefully, but have to continue to underscore that things like SB 1070 in Arizona and some of the things that have been said on Capitol Hill and in state capitals are only poisoning the way people perceive this relationship. And we have to use the bully pulpit to explain why this is so important. And this is why I'm very happy to be able to join you, even if it's for a few moments here today, to underscore that in this endeavor, we need to work together, that we need to engage American civil society, but we also need to engage with Mexican civil society in having everyone understand what's at stake here and how we need to continue working together to ensure that we can get this one critically important issue right. Thank you very much.
Well, I rest my case. I said he was a winner. Mr. Ambassador, would you have a few minutes to take a couple of questions?
Delighted.
Okay, why don't we open the floor for a couple of minutes to take a couple questions? We have some takers? I can't. Oh. Can you stand up and just identify yourself and then speak up?
Okay, my name is Alfredo. I would like to ask Mr.
I'm sorry, but I just mentioned that we're not going to respond questions to the press directly.
Any other questions? Yes. Okay.
So the question briefly, and correct me if I missed something, but the question is, with all the wealth that Mexico has, oil wealth and other kinds of wealth that you hear about all the time, why is it that Mexico can't produce enough wealth to keep immigrants in Mexico, keep them in their own country?
That's a question for a full-fledged seminar. And I don't know if I'm going to have enough time, but let me try and respond this way. I think that Mexico still faces some very important structural challenges inherited from decades of one-party rule, but also of a past that certainly hobbled Mexico's ability to enact policies which would have allowed it to grow at a much faster rate of growth. I think the important challenge that we face today is that while at the same time that we have the most well-prepared, well-trained, young population that Mexico has today, in fact, what demographers call a demographic bonus, we still have to further deregulate the economy. The whole debate over whether Mexico allows private investment, whether foreign or domestic, in its energy sector is still a debate that challenges political parties and politicians in Mexico. It's an issue that needs to be confronted, but as most of you in this room know, it's an issue that historically has had a lot of baggage. I think there are some reforms that are starting to move in that direction, but clearly they're not enough. There are many issues of corporatist control that we are breaking down as Mexico has become a fully democratic nation, especially probably from the mid-'80s forward. I don't believe in magic dates, but I think there's certainly 3 or 4 moments at least since 68, but then in 1968, but then expanding very quickly in the 80s and 90s that have allowed Mexico to become a fully democratic nation. But still there are many challenges, not only the structure and the monopoly of economic power, but as to how we take on some of the challenges in terms of unions, unions that have an impact on the quality of education. So I think there are a number of factors, but still, having said all of this, if you look at the pounding that the global economy took in 2009, last year Mexico grew at a 5.2 rate, and our unemployment was 4.5. I don't want to ask my American colleagues here from the State Department what the United States would want to give to get those numbers, but I think it is certainly a very powerful signal that we have started to do certain things right, and that the challenge is to be able to maintain those numbers and those levels of growth over a long period of time, because what we can't see and what Mexico has traditionally seen in its past is a roller coaster. We grow a year, we fall 2 years, we grow another year, and then we fall again. In fact, one of the great secrets that nobody tells and nobody writes about in the press today, which in my book is probably the most important success story of modern Mexico, is that the combination of sustained, sensible macroeconomic policies since 1994, which was a devastating economic crisis in Mexico, along with Mexico's mooring to the international economy via NAFTA, plus what is probably today the most widely respected poverty alleviation program on the face of the earth, Oportunidades. These three things combined have, for the first time in Mexico's modern history, started to create a middle class. It's not a surprise and it's not rocket science that, and this will not be an infomercial for these companies, but I think it's very telling. It's not rocket science to figure out why Walmart and Costco have the largest number of stores outside the United States today in Mexico, and why Best Buy is opening the largest number of new stores in Mexico over the next 5 years. Why? Because there is an economic class, there's a middle class that has started to grow and expand. And this is probably, over the long term, which will hopefully address your concern in the question of how can Mexico guarantee sustained economic growth, social justice, and the elimination of extreme poverty. And I think that we sometimes, as crabs, we walk two steps forward, one step sideways, and sometimes one step back. But I think the general momentum that we're starting to see on a number of macroeconomic indicators suggests that some of these reforms have started to kick in. And then I think somebody, same question? Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, can you give us the Mexican government's view on the effects that NAFTA may have had on driving migrants to the United States? And in retrospect, do you think there should have been some sort of labor agreement attached to that?
I'll start with the second part. Definitely. I think that one of the big mistakes that was made when NAFTA was devised, designed, implemented was the lack of chapters and sections that would deal with labor mobility. But as most things in life, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Because if we had put on the table in 1991 when we started negotiating NAFTA a labor mobility clause, this country would have shut down NAFTA. It would have never been approved. And we must remember what NAFTA was designed to do. NAFTA was designed to enhance trade. It wasn't enhanced to combat extreme poverty. It wasn't designed to mitigate migration. It was targeted at fostering and triggering trade, and that has done it has done excellently well. Mexico today is the United States' second trading partner on the face of the earth. We trade $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion a day in both directions. So in terms of triggering trade, it has been a very important success. There have been some collateral effects on sectors and constituencies that have not been able to compete. But I'll give you the example of the rural sector and particularly corn, production of corn in Mexico. I'm sure that many of you have either read or heard that NAFTA obliterated Mexico's ability to compete in the production of corn. And for those of you who know Mexico well, and for those of you who come from Mexico, you know that corn is not only one of the most important parts of the dietary staple of Mexico, but it has a very profound cultural role in the country. However, let's pause for a minute. In 1993, when we were about to negotiate and sign NAFTA, Mexico was producing 17 million tons of corn per year. Last year, Mexico produced 56 million tons of corn per year. So it's not that we're not being able to produce corn, and it's not that American corn is obliterating or competing with Mexican corn. It's a challenge that Mexico and successive Mexican governments were unable or unwilling to put in place social dislocation and mitigation policies so that medium and small farmers in Mexico could compete with the big agro-businesses in the north of the country, which are the ones producing 56 million tons of corn today. But they are the ones that are squeezing out of the market the subsistence, small and medium-sized farmers of Mexico. So it's not an issue of how has trade impacted this, but it's of whether we have put in place over the years, the policies that we needed to put in place at the time to mitigate social and economic dislocation of the effects of trade in Mexico. So I want to be very clear on this. I think that if you think of NAFTA as a silver bullet that will pull Mexico from its bootstraps and equilibrate or diminish the gap or the asymmetries that exist economically between those two countries, I'd say you're probably smoking too much of what we're seeing in Mexico today. But if you understand the impact of NAFTA in its multiplying effect in terms of creating opportunities for trade and trickling down and creating a larger, wider middle class that has started to grow finally for the first time probably since the late 60s and early 70s in Mexico, it has had a very profound effect. I think I have to, yeah, I have to run. Thank you. Thank you. Come on. That's it. Buen retorno. It's good to see you. Take care. Thank you. Thanks for your help. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're really, really very grateful that you could spend this time with us. We're all enlightened. Our next speaker is no stranger to the bishops of the United States when it comes to migration and immigration issues. His Excellency Rafael Romo Munoz is the Archbishop of Tijuana. For some years, he has cooperated with this committee on issues of migration. He worked with us on the pastoral letter that was issued by the bishops of Mexico and the United States. He has worked with us on the consultations that we hold annually and will be working with us on the consultation that will be held in San Jose in June. He is in pretty close competition with Archbishop Gomez as to who has the largest number of Catholics in their archdiocese. Archbishop Romo has 4.5 million, and Archbishop Gomez 5 million. So the two of them can slug it out.
Without counting the undocumented.
Well, please join me in welcoming Archbishop Romo.
Bien, agradezco a Monseñor José Gómez, arzobispo de Los Ángeles y presidente del Comité de Migración de la Conferencia de Obispos Católicos de Estados Unidos, la invitación a participar en este encuentro. Me corresponde a mí ser el responsable de la Pastoral de Migrantes en el Episcopado Mexicano.
I want to thank Monsignor Jose Gomez, the Archbishop of Los Angeles and the chairman of the USCCB Committee on Migration, for the invitation to participate in this gathering. I personally am the head of the pastoral dimension of the Human Mobility Ministry, and I'm in Tijuana.
Nosotros como Iglesia Católica pretendemos ayudar con todo el corazón a la situación de migrantes, y esta es una respuesta pastoral como signo de amor que el Señor Jesús tiene hacia los más vulnerables, como son nuestros hermanos y hermanas migrantes, quienes finalmente son los sujetos de cambio y objetos de promoción en esta misión.
As the Catholic Church, we want to work with all of our hearts to aid our migrant brothers and sisters, and I believe that this pastoral response is the sign of the love that the Lord Jesus has for the most vulnerable, including our migrant brothers and sisters, who are in the end the agents of change in their own lives, as well as the target of the promotion work of our mission.
El propósito de estas palabras es señalar que el tema de la migración, tanto documentada como indocumentada entre Estados Unidos y México, debe asumirse con mucha responsabilidad y de manera conjunta por parte de las conferencias episcopales de ambos gobiernos, de la sociedad y de las organizaciones no gubernamentales, haciendo necesaria y urgente la cooperación de todas las partes y la aplicación de reformas a favor del ser humano.
The purpose of my talk today is to point out that the issue of migration between the United States and Mexico, both undocumented and documented migration, must be approached with great responsibility and in a joint effort by bishops' conferences, both governments, society, and non-governmental organizations. It's necessary and urgent for all parties to work together and to make reforms aimed at benefiting human beings.
Durante su viaje a Estados Unidos en el 2008, Su Santidad el Papa Benedicto XVI abordó el tema de la migración e instó porque atendiéramos la desintegración de las familias y la necesidad de centrarnos en soluciones regionales, pues la migración es un fenómeno internacional. He visto, dice el Papa, la amplitud de este problema, sobre toda la grave situación de la separación de las familias, y esto verdaderamente es peligroso para el tejido social, moral y humano de estos países. El Santo Padre insistía que la solución se encontraba en la cooperación global.
During his visit to the United States in 2008, His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI addressed the issue of migration and urged us to respond to issues such as the disintegration of the family and the need to focus on regional solutions, given that migration is an international phenomenon. The Holy Father said, "I have seen the breadth of this problem and especially the very serious situation of the separation of families. This is truly dangerous for the social, moral, and human fabric of these countries." The Holy Father reiterated that solution must be found in global cooperation.
El contexto migratorio actual ha sufrido un giro de 180 grados en esta parte del continente. Lo he percibido desde el trabajo pastoral que he acompañado en estos más de 4 años que llevo como responsable de esta dimensión. Los costos humanos sociales que sufren nuestros y nuestras hermanos y hermanas migrantes son muy altos. Soy testigo de ello y lo he visto con dolor. Esto me ha impulsado a buscar una pastoral migratoria que se centre en la persona humana, reflejo del Dios con nosotros.
The current context of migration has gone through a 180-degree turn in this part of the continent. In my 4 years as the head of the pastoral dimension of the Human Mobility Ministry, I have seen our migrant brothers and sisters bear extremely high human and social costs for this turn. I have witnessed this and felt the pain involved, and that has moved me to seek a migration ministry that's focused on the human person, the reflection of God with us.
Mi responsabilidad es solo la continuación de lo que ya la Iglesia viene buscando desde el año 99, cuando inició un diálogo entre las conferencias episcopales de México y Estados Unidos, mismo que nos permitió sistematizar una respuesta pastoral.
The work I do is just a continuation of what the Church has been doing since 1999, when it began a dialogue with the bishops' conferences of Mexico and the United States, a dialogue that has allowed us to systematize a pastoral response.
Entre las preocupaciones que puntualizamos fueron la reintegración de las familias, el respeto a la dignidad y los derechos humanos de las personas migrantes, las políticas migratorias de ambos países, el refugio y el asilo, la trata de personas en todas sus expresiones, laboral, sexual, tráfico de órganos, el cuidado pastoral de la vida cristiana, sacramental y pastoral de los mexicanos y latinoamericanos en los Estados Unidos.
Among the various priorities we specified were the reunification of families, respect for the dignity and human rights of migrants, changes in migration policies of both countries, refugees and asylum cases, human trafficking in all of its expressions, whether it be for labor, sexual, or organ trafficking purposes, and pastoral care in Christian, sacramental, and pastoral lives of Mexicans and Latin Americans in the United States.
La atención a estos temas nos motivó a ambas conferencias episcopales a la elaboración de una carta pastoral llamada Juntos en el Camino de la Esperanza, ya no somos extranjeros. La aplicación de la misma provocó distintas acciones.
As we dealt with these issues, both bishops' conferences were motivated to draft together a pastoral letter called Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope. And the application of the concepts of this letter led to action.
Quiero antes comentar, fuimos preparando este trabajo de este resultado, este documento, de tal manera que impresionantemente le dedicamos los obispos de México una asamblea completa a concluir este trabajo. Simultáneamente también el episcopado americano examinaba el mismo texto en una asamblea, teniendo nosotros un representante de ellos y teniendo ellos un representante de nosotros.
And I just want to say that in the preparation of this document, the pastoral letter that came out jointly, the bishops of Mexico, we dedicated an entire assembly to this topic. And at the very same time, the bishops in the United States were examining the same text and coming up with their conclusions and their contributions in their own assembly. And we had a representative from the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference, and they had a representative from our Bishops' Conference.
Abundo todavía. Este documento llegó hasta el presidente de los Estados Unidos y también a nuestro presidente. O sea, es un documento que realmente tuvo que ver en las deliberaciones de los distintos gobiernos.
And I also want to say that this document got to the President of the United States and to the President of our country, and it was a document that really had an influence on the deliberations on this topic.
En la estructura pastoral, con impactos legislativos y jurídicos, estas son las acciones que provocó, entre las cuales se hicieron propuestas concretas entregadas en su momento al presidente de la República Mexicana, Vicente Fox, y actualmente a la administración del actual presidente Calderón, sobre un sistema de migración más generoso, justo y humano que se reflejara en la iniciativa de la ley.
And so among some of the actions that came out of this were legislative and legal impacts. There were concrete policy proposals that were made at various times to the President of Mexico, Vicente Fox, and then later to the Calderón administration. And these were proposals for a more generous, just, and humane migration system to be reflected in any legislative initiatives.
Se buscaron, como otra acción, se buscaron iniciativas comunes que promovieran la solidaridad entre los países y los católicos de ambos pueblos.
And we also sought common initiatives to promote solidarity between our two countries and among Catholics in both countries.
Ambas conferencias seguimos insistiendo a los Estados Unidos por una reforma migratoria integral y justa que mejore los programas de legalización, la atención a los trabajadores temporales y preserve la unión familiar.
Both bishops' conferences have continued to reiterate to the United States the need for a just and comprehensive immigration reform that would improve legalization programs, provide better framework for temporary workers, and preserve family unity.
Nuestra tarea, en este sentido, sigue siendo hasta el día de hoy velar para que las políticas migratorias de los países atiendan las diferentes etapas del proceso migratorio: origen, tránsito, destino, retorno. Así es como nos referimos al movimiento migratorio: origen, de donde brotan; tránsito, por donde pasan; destino, a donde van; y luego el retorno. Y de manera más puntual, insistir en encontrar soluciones apegadas al respeto de la dignidad humana, salvaguardando los derechos humanos.
And so our task continues in this sense today. We have to ensure that migration policies provide protection for migrants at various phases of the migration process. So we look at the places of origin, the transition as migrants pass through various countries, the places of destination, the places and countries at which the migrants arrive, and in the case of return, in those places of return as well. It's urgent to find solutions rooted in respect for human dignity and solutions that safeguard human rights.
La migración implica una acción conjunta. Por una parte, los Estados Unidos deben proteger el bienestar común incluyendo el desarrollo de las personas migrantes. Por otra parte, el gobierno mexicano debe examinar cómo proteger y promover al más pobre, vulnerable y desposeído.
Migration requires action on both sides of the border. On one hand, the United States must protect the common well-being of migrants, including the development of migrants. On the other hand, Mexican government must examine how to protect and promote the poorest, most vulnerable, and the dispossessed.
Asegurándose ambos países que los migrantes estén protegidos del abuso, de la corrupción y que los peligros que conlleva la migración sean reducidos al mínimo. En México, la tarea, como lo decía ahora el embajador, la tarea es seguir creando las condiciones en el país para que los pobres no se vean obligados a emigrar hacia los Estados Unidos.
Both countries must ensure that migrants be protected from abuse and corruption and that the dangers inherent in migration be reduced to a minimum. In Mexico, the task is, as the ambassador just said, the task is to continue creating conditions in the country such that the poor will no longer be forced to emigrate to the United States.
Las conferencias episcopales partimos de la experiencia de vivir con ellos, espacio que se ha vuelto un referente en ambas naciones, y con organismos internacionales que nos obliga a seguir fortaleciendo el diálogo con nuestros gobiernos para denunciar y compartir las preocupaciones y proponer alternativas de solución a los problemas que rodean al fenómeno migratorio.
We in the bishops' conferences begin from a point of living with and accompanying migrants, and this space has become a reference point in both countries and with international organizations. And it obliges us to continue to strengthen this dialogue with our governments in order to denounce abuses, share concerns, and propose alternative solutions to the problems surrounding the phenomenon of migration.
Los migrantes merecen la protección de la ley, normalizando su situación jurídica, abriendo un proceso de regularización migratoria amplia. A pesar de no estar regularizada su situación jurídica, merecen ser respetados como personas en condición irregular, la cual deviene del incumplimiento de normas administrativas y en ningún caso criminales, ni tampoco implica la pérdida de sus derechos como personas.
Migrants deserve the protection of the law and the normalization of their legal status. So a broad process must be open for the regularization of their status. But even when their legal situation has not been regularized, they deserve to be respected as human beings who simply have an irregular status, a status that comes from noncompliance with administrative rules, but in no case is a criminal act, nor does it imply the loss of their rights as human beings.
En México, la Iglesia ha estado presente en la actualización de la iniciativa de ley migratoria. Aún no se ha publicado, pero cuenta con avances en la distribución de funciones que tendría el Instituto Nacional de Migración y las policías. La policía actuará solamente a petición del instituto. Esta tendrá que ser un ejemplo que diferencia las políticas policiales que están surgiendo en Estados Unidos de Norteamérica a una política integral que no criminaliza la migración ni a la gente que les ayuda.
In Mexico, the Church has been present in the process of updating the migration law. And the bill has not gone into effect yet, but it contains advances in the distribution of the roles of the National Migration Institute and the police. The police will only act at the request of the Institute. So this will be an example that's very different from the police policies that are emerging in the United States of North America, and it can be an example of an element of a comprehensive policy that does not criminalize migrants or the people who help them.
Abundo en esto. Hemos tenido increíblemente mucho contacto con el Senado, con los senadores. Hemos podido influenciar para que este cambio, esta reforma de ley que no criminalice a los migrantes, finalmente se ha logrado eso con grandísima alegría. Ya el Senado aprobó este cambio en la ley y lo turna finalmente a donde se tomará la última decisión, pero creemos que va a ser aprobado.
This is something I want to add to because we've had a lot of contact with the Senate on this particular bill, on the migration policy bill, and we've had some influence on it, and so that migrants would not be criminalized in the process of making this bill. And we're very happy with the result of our work and the result of what's come out of the Senate. The Senate has approved this. It has not it still needs to go through a final phase of approval, but we're very optimistic that that will happen.
Aunque se ha tenido un avance, todavía falta un camino por recorrer. Consideramos que se debe prestar gran atención a los grupos del crimen organizado que en muchos casos operan impunemente a lo largo de nuestras fronteras y dentro de nuestros propios países, particularmente a los que se involucran en el tráfico de drogas, de personas y de armas y de otras cosas.
So in spite of this progress, however, there's a lot left to do. More attention has to be given to the control of organized crime groups who in many cases are operating with impunity along our borders and inside our countries, particularly those that are involved in trafficking of drugs, human beings, weapons, etc.
Estos grupos delictivos asociados a cárteles no solamente amenazan a los migrantes mediante el secuestro, sino a sus defensores, sus ciudades y comunidades locales.
These criminal groups associated with cartels not only threaten migrants by kidnapping them, they also threaten people who defend migrants, they threaten their cities and their local communities.
Las redes de tráfico y trata de personas constituyen un horrible crimen que debe ser eliminado y que golpea cruelmente a mujeres, hombres y niños.
Human trafficking and smuggling networks are horrible crimes that must be eliminated because they're subjecting men, women, and children to great cruelty.
Abundo. Cada año tenemos un taller en el que nos reunimos todos los agentes de migrantes, los agentes de Pastoral. El último taller lo tuvimos en Nogales, Sonora, con la cercanía pues a Arizona.
I want to also add that every year we have a workshop, and when I say we, I mean the pastoral agents that are working on the issue of migration. Last year we had this meeting in Nogales, in Sonora, which is on the other side of the border from Arizona.
Hay un corredor, así se puede llamar, es un arroyo seco, un corredor donde se traslada a los migrantes a través de los polleros, de los que habló aquí el embajador. Y para nosotros poder entrar allí a nuestro taller, tuvimos que pedir permiso al crimen organizado.
There's a corridor, there's a dry riverbed through which migrants are taken up to the United States by the polleros or the smugglers that the ambassador mentioned. And for us to be able to go in and to have a meeting in that area, we had to ask permission from organized crime groups.
Los migrantes van en vehículos amontonados, pagando un precio para que los conduzcan a la frontera, y los vehículos están identificados, ya no los revisan. A nosotros sí nos revisaban.
Migrants travel piled up in cars. They pay money to people to take them to the border, and these vehicles are already identified, and so they're not checked and they go through. But we were checked.
Urgimos a los presidentes de Estados Unidos, de México, de América Central y al primer ministro de Canadá a encontrar consensos sobre la cooperación regional en los temas de migración y desarrollo, incluyendo un planteamiento y una solución a las raíces que causan la migración.
So another thing that we need to do is that we need to urge the presidents of the United States, Mexico, and Central America, as well as the Prime Minister of Canada, to find consensuses on regional cooperation on matters of migration and development, including a solution for the root problems of migration.
Requerimos un acuerdo entre México y Estados Unidos que ayude a crear caminos legales que protejan a los migrantes a los dos lados de la frontera.
We need an agreement between Mexico and the United States that will help to create legal pathways for migration that will protect migrants on both sides of the border.
Urgimos a nuestros hermanos obispos, sacerdotes, católicos en general y personas de buena voluntad a acoger en las comunidades con amor y solicitud a los migrantes que pasan por los caminos de América Central, México, Estados Unidos y Canadá.
We urge our brother bishops and priests, Catholics in general, and all people of goodwill to welcome migrants with love and concern on every point of their migration in Central America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
Es necesario que ellos y ellas se sientan apoyados desde sus comunidades de origen hasta sus lugares de destino, y que este acompañamiento no les falte durante la larga, fatigosa y peligrosa travesía que realizan.
They need to feel supported from their communities of origin to their places of destination, and this accompaniment must not be lacking during the long, tiring, and dangerous journey that they make.
Hacemos un llamado para que se vuelvan a examinar las políticas de protección al refugiado y al asilado. Mujeres, niños, familias escapan por razones políticas, por razones de violencia y otras formas de persecución, pero no reciben una protección adecuada en otros países.
So we call on governments to examine once again the policies for protecting refugees and those who seek asylum, women, children, entire families who must flee for political reasons from violence and other forms of persecution, but who are not receiving adequate protection in other countries.
Estas preocupaciones no se han quedado solo como una preocupación de parte de la Iglesia de México y Estados Unidos, sino que se ha extendido a las conferencias episcopales en el área de migrantes de Centroamérica y del Caribe, considerando que queremos estar presentes en todos los procesos migratorios que vive la persona del migrante, origen, tránsito, destino y retorno.
These concerns are not only the occupation of the Church in Mexico and the United States, they're also shared by the bishops' conferences in Central America and the Caribbean, who are working on the area of migration as well. We want to be present in all of the processes of migration that the migrant must go through, from the point of origin, the transit, the place of destination, and in case of return.
Como pastores de millones de católicos de este hemisferio, tenemos la obligación de defender los derechos de todos los miembros de nuestro rebaño, particularmente de los más vulnerables.
As pastors of millions of Catholics in the hemisphere, we have the obligation to defend the rights of all of the members of our flock, particularly the most vulnerable.
Instamos a todos los fieles y personas de buena voluntad de nuestras naciones a que se solidaricen con las personas migrantes y a que trabajen por un trato más justo y humano de los mismos.
And we urge all of the faithful and all people of goodwill in our nations to be in solidarity with migrant persons and to work for a more just and humane treatment of migrants.
Hace 4 años, hace 4 años, cuando el responsable de Estados Unidos era Monseñor Barn, nos encontramos en un encuentro sencillamente de amigos, pasamos un día a gusto trabajando de esto, él con su equipo, yo con mi equipo. Quedamos tan de veras motivados que dijimos, esto no se queda aquí, hagámoslo ahora. En esa ocasión fue en San Bernardino, hagámosla dentro de un año y hagámosla en Tijuana. Al año siguiente fuimos a Tijuana, pero abundó la gente interesada. Incluso nuestro propio nuncio, que era reciente, se enteró, no lo habíamos invitado, se enteró y se hizo presente porque inquietaba, y ya éramos muchos obispos, no nada más Monseñor Barn y su servidor, éramos ya 15 o 20 obispos. Ahí acordamos, sigamos adelante. Monseñor Wester nos decía, desearía que fuera la siguiente en Washington, pero ahorita no sabemos lo del cambio de presidente, mejor un año más tarde. Bueno, ese año nos fuimos a Guatemala. El año pasado ya la tuvimos aquí en Washington, y estamos ya programados para Costa Rica, y es siempre un grupo de los obispos de aquí con tanto interés, con tanto gusto. Compartimos nuestras necesidades, nuestros proyectos, nuestras inquietudes y nuestro amor por la causa.
I wanted to say that 4 years ago, the head of the issue of migration in the United States, Monsignor Barnes, he and I got together. It was kind of a meeting of friends. He had his team and I had mine. And we were so motivated by our conversation and what had come out of our gathering that we said, let's do it again. That particular meeting was San Bernardino. We decided that the next meeting would be in Tijuana. Well, the next year, more people came. And in fact, people that we hadn't even invited came. Our nuncio came. A lot of bishops found out that we were going to be gathering and discussing migration. And we ended up with 15 to 20 bishops that year. And we said, let's have the next one in Washington. And we weren't quite sure how to work that out yet because there was a change in the chair. So the next one was in Guatemala. But then we did have the meeting last year in Washington. And the next year, the meeting will be in Costa Rica. So we have this group of bishops who have a great deal of interest on this issue. And we are committed to looking at the needs and continuing to work for the love of this particular cause.
Concluyo. Ahora la prensa, Univisión, la televisión preguntaba, ¿qué hacen? ¿Qué hace la iglesia por los migrantes? Y con entusiasmo le dijimos, llevamos esta pasión en el corazón, trabajamos por ellos y por eso estamos aquí también. Yo me sorprendo realmente de la importancia y la resonancia que aquí del Comité de Migrantes y que ahora está bajo la responsabilidad de Monseñor Gómez asume. Me sorprendo. Nosotros no tenemos tanto, pero sí desearíamos también llegar a algo más. Agradezco en el nombre de nuestro Señor Jesucristo a quienes con esfuerzo y dedicación sirven a los migrantes en las casas de acogida, en las comunidades y en las familias, aún corriendo riesgos y peligros de muerte. Muchas gracias.
A short time ago, just a little while ago, the press was asking me what do we do as the Catholic Church on this issue of migration. And I was trying to express to them how much passion we have in our hearts for this issue and how much importance we give to this issue. And I've been very pleased to be here in the United States and to see the work of the Committee on Migration under the leadership of Monsignor Gomez. I think they have a level of responsibility and work that is really very high and that has impressed me greatly. We'd like to do the same. And finally, in the name of Lord Jesus Christ, I'm grateful for all of those whose effort and dedication has led them to welcome migrants in shelters, in communities, and in families, in spite of risks and even the threat of death.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. We may have time for maybe one question. Who's it going to be? No question? Okay, so we're going to move on. Oh, there's one. A quick one. Well, we have a translator.
If you don't mind.
English.
If you don't mind.
Just a question, Archbishop. I mean, you mentioned the participation of organized crime in Sonora. To what extent are we seeing a convergence between those who are smuggling immigrants and the organized crime groups that are involved in other activities? And how has that changed the nature of migrants' journey?
Sí, esto es tremendo. Nosotros documentamos, documentamos simplemente por tener memoria. Documentamos nuestro trato, nuestro servicio, nuestro encuentro con los migrantes.
Yes, this is a very difficult situation. We document everything so that we will have a memory of our meetings and our work with the migrants.
Fue tan sorprendente cuando hicimos un análisis que en 6 meses, medio año, habíamos documentado más de 9,000 secuestros de migrantes.
And it was very surprising as we looked at the analysis of our numbers that in 6 months, in half a year, there were more than 9,000 kidnappings of migrants.
A cada migrante le piden mínimo $3,000.
Every migrant is asked to pay a minimum of $3,000 to cross the border.
9,000, más de 9,000 son 27 millones de dólares.
And
Lo que se puede resultar.
That was the ransom. And so with 9,000 people who were kidnapped, then you're looking at $27 million.
cuando la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos, que llamamos CNDH, Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos, se dio cuenta de esto, nos pidió permiso de darle un sesgo legal.
When the National Human Rights Commission in Mexico, the CNDH, realized the extent of this problem, when they saw the numbers, they asked us to do some legal specific work on this.
Y ellos presentaron esto al gobierno, esto lo presentaron ellos, como si fuera de ellos, pero siendo leales de que venía de acá.
Ellos presentaron quiénes? CNDH. Okay. And so the National Human Rights Commission then presented this special report on the case of kidnapping of migrants, but it was actually the information that came from us.
Esto afectó mucho a Estados Unidos, a México, afectó mucho, porque vinieron recomendaciones de todas partes del mundo, recomendaciones internacionales.
This had a big impact in Mexico. There are recommendations that came from all parts of the world.
No quisieron creernos a nosotros, los de Pastoral de Migrantes, diciéndonos que no tenía valor científico lo que habíamos hecho.
Some people didn't want to believe us. They said that the documentation that we had done did not have scientific value.
En septiembre pasado, en julio pasado, nos convocaron de gobierno a nosotros para decirnos esto no tiene validez y me entregaron un documento semejante por parte de gobierno para declarar que no era científico, que no era válido.
In fact, it was last July when government representatives asked us for a meeting, and they said that the documentation that we had done was not valid. It hadn't been scientifically done, and they gave us a similar document.
Nosotros decíamos, simplemente documentamos lo que vemos, nada más.
We just said, we just document what we see, that's all.
Y un mes más tarde, de julio a agosto, hubo el escándalo de los 72 asesinados en Tamaulipas.
And 1 month later, from July to August, there was the scandal of the 70 migrants who were killed in Tamaulipas.
Y dijimos, ese es lo científico, ahí está, ¿qué quieren? Ahí está.
And we said, what do you want? How scientific do you want it? There it is. That's what we're talking about.
Eso es lo que documentamos.
And so that's what we've been able to document.
Once again, thank you, Archbishop. Our next speaker, as I mentioned earlier, is the Archbishop of Los Angeles. He has an archdiocese of 5 million persons. That is a tremendous responsibility. It's larger than many countries I've lived in. And to provide the leadership and the pastoral care of such a large archdiocese is really an enormous responsibility. Archbishop Gomez assumed his duties just a matter of weeks ago on the 1st of March. And we certainly want to wish you the very best in your new assignment. The Archbishop is much younger than I am, but we do have something in common. We both have accounting in our background. And I managed to get a chuckle out of him when I showed him a cartoon that I keep on the front door of my office. And it shows a king in his castle, and he's on the balcony looking out over his flock. And there are thousands of them there. And one of his subjects looks at him and says to another subject, "And to think he came from accounting." So with that, please join me in welcoming Archbishop Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah, we are taking over the world, accountants. Good evening to everyone. Somehow, tonight I feel that I'm preaching to the choir. as we say in Spanish, vendiendo miel al colmenero. But I'm very happy to be with all of you today, and I want to thank Archbishop Romo, Ambassador Sarukan, and Assistant Secretary Schwartz for your participation in tonight's program. I also want to welcome and acknowledge my brother bishops that are here, that are also teachers in the faith and experts in immigration. And I especially want to welcome a good friend of mine, the Secretary of State of the great state of Texas, Madam Hope Andrade. Welcome. Today, as we have noticed, we are in a special time in the relationship between Mexico and the United States. I don't know how much time do we still have, but I want to make 3 points tonight. I have 3 basic goals. First, I want to outline what I believe to be the root issue with U.S.-Mexican migration. Second, I want to explain the Catholic Church's approach to these issues. And third, and finally, I want to make some suggestions and observations about the current debate in light of Catholic principles. So for me, the most essential issue that is at the root of the reality of the immigration crisis that we are facing is what Bishop DiMarzio said this afternoon. It's basically a matter of work. For me, the issue is rooted in the process of economic globalization. Globalization has expanded opportunities for businesses and for workers. But it has also created new problems in the relationships between our nations. The biggest problem, and it was mentioned before too, is that while we have developed laws and policies to govern the flow of capital and money, we have no standards for the movement of laborers. Was mentioned before, the NAFTA treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement, eliminated tariffs and many restrictions on trade and business in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. But as it was mentioned before, it didn't include a treaty concerning the mobility of persons. Money, capital, and other resources now flow more freely between our nations. But human persons, the men and women who do the work, cannot. In the new global economy, there are many safeguards for businesses and financial institutions, but very few for workers. Globalization has exposed, and in some cases made worse, the economic inequalities that exist within and between our nations. To put it very simply, as long as workers can earn more in 1 hour in the United States than they can earn in a day or a week in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, they will continue to seek by any means necessary to migrate to this country. That's my first point. The primary issues affecting migration between our two countries are economic. My second point is this. The Catholic Church approach to immigration is not about politics or economics. It is rooted in the vision of human society that was taught to us by Jesus Christ. The Catholic Church, from the time of the first Pentecost, has been a family of nations. By definition, the Catholic Church is universal. One family of God, drawn from all nations, people, and languages. In fact, the Catholic Church in the United States is a kind of microcosm of what Jesus intended the church to be. I have seen that, especially in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. We have Mass every month in 42 languages. people from all over the world. But that's the same in the whole United States. We are in this country a church of nearly 60 different ethnic groups from Asia, Africa, the Near East, and Latin America. More than 1/3 of the Catholics in our country today are Hispanics. The point is that in the Catholic Church and in the eyes of God, no one is a stranger or an alien. Practically speaking, for us, U.S. Mexican immigration is a religious and family issue. Because the majority of the immigrants we are talking about are Catholics. They are our brothers and sisters in Christ. So the Church's approach to these issues starts from Christ's command to preach the good news of God's love for all peoples. It starts from Christ's call that we transform the city of man into the family of God. And then, an interesting point is what many people do not realize, but we all know, is that Jesus Christ himself was an immigrant and a refugee. This is how the Church understands the account in the Gospel of how Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were forced into exile in Egypt when Herod was looking for the child Jesus to kill him. It's a beautiful quote of Pope Benedict XVI about this. He said, "In this misfortune, the flight to Egypt, experienced by the family of Nazareth, we can catch a glimpse of the painful condition in which all immigrants live. The hardships and humiliations, the deprivation and fragility of millions and millions of migrants." He said, "The family of Nazareth reflects the image of God safeguarded in the heart of every human family, even if disfigured and weakened by emigration." Beautiful words that reflect a long tradition in the Church that goes back to the Gospels. As we know, Christians have always practiced hospitality. The Church has always worked to defend the stranger and care for the immigrant. Even the Roman emperors, who hated the Christians, were amazed by their benevolence to strangers. And Catholics, as we all know, care for immigrants because Jesus commanded it. Because he told us that we must seek God and serve God in the least of our brothers and sisters. Jesus said that when we serve those who are hungry and homeless, in prison and sick, we are serving him. He even made a point of talking about immigrants and refugees. He said, it's in Matthew's Gospel, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me. As you did to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." As we also know, in the 2,000 years of history of the Church has developed a body of social teachings that are based on the principles of reason and the values of the Gospel. We all remember how Pope John Paul II said that we Catholics are experts in humanity. I wish more people knew the Church's social teaching, including our own Catholics. Because this teaching is a real contribution to human civilization. And Archbishop Romo was telling us how they were helping the Senate in Mexico to understand the issue of immigration based on the teachings of the Catholic Church. So in the teachings of the Catholic Church, I want to mention three basic principles. The first is this: the human family is one. Although we have different ethnic origins and we are spread across different continents, regions, and national boundaries. God has made us to be one family. And God did not create the good things of this earth, its natural resources and opportunities, only for the privileged few, or only for people in certain countries. God intends the good things of His creation to be shared by all, no matter where we are born or where we find ourselves living. Basic first principle: human family is one. Second principle is the sanctity of the human person and the family. Our right to life comes from God. That right does not depend on the whims of politicians or powerful people. That right does not depend on economic or political forces. Our right comes from God. And no man, no institution, and no set of circumstances can justify denying those rights. On this point of the inalienable rights of the person, we should notice that the Church's teachings are consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948, and also with the Charter of Liberties in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. For us, the universal human rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness imply the right to emigrate, to leave our country if we must, to seek a better life for our families and ourselves. In a world divided by war, famine, persecution, and economic dislocations, immigration becomes a crucial guarantee of our right to life. The Church's third principle is that governments have the right to control migration into their countries and to defend their borders. This is important. It means that nations must look at their security and their economic interest in making decisions about who and how many people they allow into their countries. And it means also that immigrants must respect the laws of the countries they emigrate to. But the Church also teaches, and we all know that national sovereignty should never be used as an excuse to deny the rights of needy and decent people who are seeking their livelihood. No country can deny this basic human right to migrate out of fears for national security or selfish concerns about threats to domestic jobs or standards of living. So those are three basic principles in the Church teachings regarding immigration. My final point tonight. Let me offer some observations on the current impasse we have reached in the debate of immigration in this country. I understand, as we all do, the political frustration over this issue. It seems to me that there has been a failure of leadership, and this failure of leadership cuts across party lines. And we all understand, sadly, the political impasse in which we are. But, my friends, from a moral standpoint, the results are intolerable and inexcusable. And I'm not speaking as a politician or as even just as a leader of, or a leader of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. I'm talking as a pastoral souls. As our brother bishops can share, I'm sure they share with the same sentiment with me. We are deeply concerned about the lives of millions of men and women and children. That's our concern. Not just the souls of the 12 million without papers who are living at the margins of our society. I'm worried, as we all are, about their physical, moral, and spiritual health. When you are a stranger in a strange land and unwanted, you are easy prey for exploitation. But more than that, when you are a stranger who is despised, it gets harder every day to hold onto your cultural identity, your moral compass, your religion, your dignity. You start to believe what people say about you, that you are not good. I'm also worried about our social fabric and civic debate. Right now, in this country, there are a lot of people, a lot of good people, who are saying things they know they should never be saying about immigrants, because they are our brothers and sisters. The anger and frustration is understandable, but the rhetoric and many other political responses are not worthy of America's proud history as a beacon of hope for the world's poor and persecuted. Our current policies of enforcement, detentions, and deportations are a humanitarian tragedy. We are destroying families in the name of enforcing our laws. It is true that many immigrants are in our country illegally. That bothers me. I don't like it when our rule of law is broken. And I support just and appropriate punishment like community service. But right now we are imposing penalties that leave wives without husbands, children without parents. We are deporting fathers and leaving single mothers to raise children on little to no income. We are better people than that. We have always been a nation of justice and law. We have also been a nation of mercy and forgiveness. I'm sure that we can find a better way. And I think it begins with the Catholic perspective. It begins in seeing immigrants as human persons, as mothers and fathers, as children of God. Practically speaking, I would like to see a moratorium on new state and local immigration legislation. And as the U.S. bishops have called for, I would like to see an end to the harsh federal worksite enforcement rates, and I think that's already happened, and the severe deportation policies. We need to push for the protections of the most vulnerable migrants, children and women, who often fall prey to traffickers and others, as we just heard. We also need reforms in how we issue visas, especially for immigrants and people who are here, who have families and live here in our country. I also would like to see our governments, the governments of the countries in Latin America and the U.S. government, to talk and find the solution for these challenging problems. We need to find ways to target economic development to the point that fewer Mexicans will feel compelled to leave their homes than to seek jobs and money in our country. It is especially important that we work to promote small businesses and agriculture. All of these simple measures will make a huge difference in the lives of millions of people. It's not that difficult. We just need the political will, and we also need the understanding of human nature and the human person that we have learned from the fact that we all are children of God. I believe that today's immigrants, like generations of immigrants before them, are the hope for tomorrow's America. I appreciate your attention tonight, and I'm grateful for all that you are doing and continue to do to promote the cause of human dignity and the common good in every aspect of the relationship between our two countries. Thank you, and I look forward to continue our conversation.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. We're making progress. We have time for about let's say, 2 questions. Do we have any takers? Going once? Going twice? You have one?
No, no questions. I'm very happy.
Okay, sold.
It's
Thank you very
preaching
much.
to the choir, you see.
We now come to our final speaker of the evening, Assistant Secretary Eric Schwartz. Assistant Secretary Schwartz leads the office in the U.S. Department of State for population, refugees, and migration. When the last occupant of that position left in the last administration, those of us in the resettlement community were quite concerned as to who would be the new Assistant Secretary of State. And all kinds of rumors circulated. And when we found out that it was Eric Schwartz, we were very pleased. And we were pleased for several reasons. He's a man with extensive experience in humanitarian work, in human rights work, in protection work, in political connections with his service in the White House, and in the State Department as well. So we knew we had the right person for the job. Shortly after he was confirmed, he met with the members of the resettlement community and told us that he was committed to doing his very best for refugees and for the populations that we serve, and he's done that with really great distinction. Our office, Migration and Refugee Services, we have partnered with his office for decades. Without his office, we would have to go out of business, and we don't want to do that. He has already done tremendous work for thousands, tens of thousands of refugees, because it was under his leadership that he did something that the refugee community had been trying to secure for a number of years, and that is an increase in the allowance that is passed on to refugees. Through his leadership, that was double, and we're grateful, and you've given thousands more hope than ever. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary of State for Population and Refugees, Eric Schwartz.
Thank you. It's it's always rough to be the last speaker at 5 minutes after 8 o'clock. But I won't speak for long. I want to thank the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and Catholic University for the chance to speak to you this evening. I also welcome the comments of Archbishop Gomez and Archbishop Romo and the ambassador from Mexico. The comments really reflect perspectives I articulated at the last fall's Global Forum on Migration and Development in Puerto Vallarta. And I believe they also largely reflect perspectives to which we in the Obama administration aspire. We share the commitment to the basic human rights of all people, whatever their status under domestic immigration law. And although I'm going to talk a little bit about our approaches and policies more broadly, beyond Mexico, for the United States, immigration from Mexico plays a central role in shaping our perspectives on international migration overall. 30% of immigrants to the United States come from our neighbor to the immediate south. And Mexican-American relations and Mexican Americans have made enormous contributions to our artistic, our educational, political culture in communities across the country. The life of Archbishop Gomez, born in Mexico, educated in Mexico, Spain, and Italy, a citizen of the United States for over a decade, illustrates the diversity that so enriches our own country. Mexican migration, to a large extent, drives this broader immigration policy debate in the United States. We all know that ours is a country of immigrants. Most Americans have immigrant ancestors in their not too distant past. We absorb in the United States about 20% of all the world's documented immigrants, and 12% of our population is foreign-born. Of course, more refugees are resettled year in and year out in the United States than in the rest of the countries of the world combined. Our tradition, our history, our values, they mandate that even as we pay due regard to the imperatives of law enforcement and security and border management, we ensure an elevated discussion and debate on migration issues. As Archbishop Gomez has said, we can indeed improve the tone and the quality of this conversation. President Obama has called for a more civil debate on immigration. We know that many citizens of our country have concerns that our immigration laws must be reformed. And we appreciate that a commitment to reform and to accountability is essential in sustaining public support for legal immigration. But we can and should engage this discussion and this debate in a spirit of common purpose and, again, with civility. In the public discussion, we can also take measures that enhance the likelihood that our debates will generate more light than heat. First, we can emphasize the contributions that migrants have made to host societies. President Obama has said, and I quote, that the steady stream of hardworking and talented people who have immigrated to the United States over the years has made the United States the engine of the global economy and a beacon of hope around the world. And this perspective is hardly unique among our political leaders, past and present. It was former President George W. Bush who expressed a similar view when he said, and I quote, that every generation of immigrants has reaffirmed the wisdom of remaining open to the talents and dreams of the world. He added that one of the primary reasons America became a great power in the 20th century is because we welcome the talent and the character and the patriotism of immigrant families. Second, it seems to me that we can convey the message that new arrivals have enhanced the strength and the vibrancy of our society. Immigrants have made important contributions to the U.S. economy since the founding days of our nation. In the year 2000, immigrant business owners generated an estimated $67 billion of the $577 billion in U.S. business income. In California, they accounted for a quarter of all the business income. And in New York, in Florida, and in New Jersey, about a fifth. Immigration has also enabled the United States of America to avoid some of the troubling demographic trends that one sees in other industrialized countries that are less hospitable to immigrants. As populations age, birth rates decline, and the revenue streams needed to sustain social programs shrink. New entrants and their families play a critical role in helping the United States to sustain our capacity to maintain crucial social programs. Third, it seems to me that we should strenuously oppose measures that discriminate or run a serious risk of discriminating against migrants. As you know, the Obama administration has opposed certain key provisions of the Arizona immigration law, which is currently subject to litigation. To be sure, governments have legitimate interests in enforcing immigration law. But while doing so, we can treat undocumented migrants with dignity and do well to remember President Obama's comment about the some 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. And I quote, "The overwhelming majority of these people, of these men and women, are simply seeking a better life for themselves and their children." Fourth, we can counter attempts to demonize those who enter the United States without authorization and work toward solutions for the majority of undocumented migrants in the United States. The President noted last summer that the overwhelming majority, as I said, of undocumented migrants are simply seeking a better life for themselves and their children. Many settle in low-wage sectors of the economy. They work hard, they save, and they stay out of trouble. The administration plans to continue to seek opportunities to work with Congress toward this goal of comprehensive immigration reform, which will meet the needs of families and businesses while honoring our tradition as a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. Fifth, I think we can emphasize the cost to society of keeping undocumented migrants underground. Because the undocumented live in the shadows, they are vulnerable to unscrupulous business, resulting in suffering, great suffering among families, individuals and families, and putting companies and citizens who do follow the rules at a disadvantage. Living in fear of the authorities also means that crimes go unreported and our streets are less safe, and billions in tax revenues are lost because many undocumented workers are paid under the table. Sixth, we can emphasize the value of providing basic safeguards to those who are undocumented through no action of their own, such as children of those who came to the United States so many years ago. Seventh, we should seek, as much as possible and consistent with our law, we should promote efforts to ensure family unification or reunification for separated family. There are actions even short of comprehensive reform that we can take. In fact, my Bureau, in partnership with the International Organization for Migration and non-governmental partners like the U.S. Catholic Conference bishops, provides for the family reunification for victims of human trafficking. Through our program, we bring to the United States family members of victims who have been able to come forward to express concerns about the treatment they've received, and have been able to avoid deportation by virtue of their willingness to come forward. The Obama administration has a strong commitment to enforcing federal laws and policies that are not only aimed at illegal immigration, but also aimed at those who abuse these migrants. We've maintained a robust effort to identify and prosecute human traffickers wherever we may find them, and we welcome congressional support on this score. Less than 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services announced that it will now grant victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation visas to remain and work legally in the United States while civil cases against their employers are pending. Intended beneficiaries include non-immigrant servants and personal staff of ambassadors, diplomats, and foreign government or international organization officials. This action follows high-profile press and NGO reports of exploitation in the households of foreign diplomats and international organization employees in Washington. Eighth, I think it's important that we remember that polls indicate that a majority of people in the United States support providing undocumented migrants with the chance to obtain legal status. A May 2010 Pew Hispanic Center poll found that nearly 70% of residents favor providing a way for undocumented immigrants currently in the country to gain citizenship if they pass background checks, pay fines, and have jobs. Immigration is nothing new to Americans. Most people in this country have known immigrants from Mexico and many other countries throughout their lives and recognize that our lives are inextricably linked in numerous ways, and that we all will rise or fall together as one community in the United States. Finally, we can emphasize that humanitarian enforcement objectives must go hand in hand. We reject the view that securing our borders and enforcing our immigration law, on the one hand, and ensuring human rights and humane treatment of migrants on the other, migrants whether they are regular, documented, or irregular. We reject the notion that these two sets of goals are inconsistent. Enforcement and humanitarian objectives can and must work in tandem. We therefore should aim to calibrate carefully our enforcement machinery with and to include robust protection safeguards. And while we may remove migrants who have entered the United States without documentation, we must ensure that all will have a meaningful opportunity to raise protection claims before they're removed, consistent with not only our international treaty obligations, but also with our humanitarian values. The United States has greatly benefited by migration to our shores, and whatever the precise contours of a system of legal immigration, our country must protect the rights of all migrants. These basic principles not only reflect our values, but also international humanitarian principles to which this administration and its predecessors has been so deeply committed. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
My question is, how do you resolve the discrepancy between your job and your mission and the lack of due process rights within our immigrant detention centers?
I'm not really, I mean, I think it's since, let me answer your specific question with a general answer, okay? And I don't, and I can't respond specifically to the issue which you raised. What I can say is that I think the principles which I articulated in these remarks, there's no question in my mind that these are principles to which this administration, from the very top, from its very leadership, these are principles to which we aspire. And I think when we are made aware of actions and activities which advocates, the church, our partners express concern are in conflict with these principles, I think we take those representations and those concerns very, very seriously. And I would certainly invite you and anyone here, if you feel that there are practices that are in conflict with the principles to which we aspire, you need to sustain that dialogue and keep pressing us. I know that my friends at the Department of Homeland Security have worked very hard, very assiduously, on issues surrounding detention reform. I give them enormous credit for those efforts in the face of considerable opposition within various parts of our political landscape. And I know that those efforts at detention reform are continuing. But is there more that we can and must do on this score? Is there more success that we have to have in our discussions with members of Congress and committees of a jurisdiction? Almost certainly. So how, so that's the best way I would answer your question. I think we just have to keep at it. If, as a public servant in government, if I found myself defeated by every instance in which somebody identified an area where my principles were not always consistent with each and every one of my practices, I would have chosen a different profession. Yes?
To add to that point, previously we had a conversation with the officials from the agency, and a point that some of us have been pondering was that I think the statistic was about 60% of the people that are apprehended have some kind of criminal record. And I don't know about the rest, but I know some of us have been troubled by that because it doesn't match a lot of the data that we have. And I think a central concern, I must say I'm very grateful and inspired to hear the sensitivity that you bring to this issue. And I guess what I would ask is maybe just some clarification on what's being done to sort of the criminalization of people whose only crime is looking for a job. And it just seems to be disproportionate with just resources dedicated to addressing this, but also in terms of lumping sort of people looking for work into a criminal basket. So something in the rhetoric of how this is being framed from some source isn't matching up, and maybe you can help us with that.
I think my colleagues at DHS who are sitting in the front row can probably help you better than I can, because this is really much more in their domain. I do know that this issue of the way in which undocumented migrants, how the concerns that have been expressed by advocates about about the way in which undocumented migrants are processed in the system, creating for them a prejudicial impact in term, that has implications for all kinds of entitlements to which they might want to access at some point. I know that those sets of issues have been very much under discussion in places like DHS. They're just not in my domain. So what I would say is, if you want to raise them with me, you should, and I will I will come back to you on it after consultation with my colleagues at the domestic agency. Which is not to say that at the State Department we don't play a role in a lot of these issues. We do. We seek to, number one, in the discussions and debates on domestic immigration law, we try to impart our knowledge and expertise on how to ensure that the international humanitarian principles that we are articulating overseas, telling friends and partners about how we think they ought to behave, consistent with widely accepted principles. I think in the domestic context, it's important that we don't end up not practicing at home what we are preaching abroad. And so the conversations between the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security in that regard are very important. They also come up in a lot of different circumstances, such as temporary protected status for people who may have reason to fear return, deferred enforced departure, a whole range of issues where the interests and equities of the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security are both engaged. That's a non-answer to your question. Okay?
I'd like to conclude by thanking all of our presenters this evening. It's been an exciting, informative, and very good program. We've had some really heavy hitters here this evening, and we do appreciate the time that they've taken out of their schedules to be with us. Thank you so much. That concludes our program.
Thank you very much. Con mucho gusto. Gracias. Thank you very much.